me start with a simple question. When governments announce their annual budgets, billions and trillions of rupees allocated to roads, defense, education, healthcare, do you think those budgets affect everyone equally? At first glance, it might seem obvious that they do. After all, a road built in a village is used by everyone. A hospital serves everyone. A school educates everyone. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Budgets are never neutral because societies are not neutral. If women and men occupy different positions in society, if they have unequal access to resources, unequal responsibilities at home, unequal mobility and unequal representation in the workforce, then the way money is allocated by governments will inevitably affect them differently. Take something as simple as public transport. If buses are unreliable or unsafe, men may still manage because their mobility is rarely questioned. But for women, who already face restrictions, safety concerns, and caregiving responsibilities, poor transport systems can mean lost job opportunities, missed education, and economic dependency. So the question is not simply how much money governments spend. The real question is who benefits from that spending. And that question lies at the heart of today's episode. Today, we are exploring a powerful yet surprisingly under-discussed idea in public policy, gender budgeting. At its core, gender budgeting asks governments to look at budgets through a simple but transformative lens. How does public spending impact women and men differently? But as we will see today, gender budgeting is not just about fairness, it's about economics, it's about justice, and ultimately it's about the kind of society we want to build. Hello and welcome back to The Personal Lens, where we explore the political through the personal. This is Jayanti. So what exactly is gender budgeting? Let's clear up a common misconception. Gender budgeting does not mean creating a separate budget for women, and it does not mean giving special financial privileges to women at the expense of men. Instead, gender budgeting is a method of analyzing government budgets to ensure that public resources are allocated in ways that reduce gender inequalities. In simple terms, it asks three key questions. Where is the money going? Who benefits from it? Does this spending reduce or reinforce gender inequality? The idea emerged in the 1980s and 1990s through feminist economists and international institutions who began questioning the assumption that economic policy is gender neutral. One of the most influential figures in this field, economist Diane Elson, argued that budgets are not merely financial documents, they are political statements of priorities. If a government spends heavily on infrastructure but neglects childcare services, it may unintentionally reinforce the expectation that women should remain at home. If agricultural subsidies go primarily to landowners and most landowners are men, then women farmers remain invisible in policy. Gender budgeting forces governments to confront these realities. It transforms budgeting from a technical exercise into a tool for social justice. Now, to truly understand why gender budgeting matters, we must talk about something economists ignored for decades. Unpaid care work, cooking, cleaning, childcare, caring for elderly parents, fetching water, managing households. These tasks are essential for the functioning of society. Yet, they are rarely counted in economic statistics. Globally, women perform 3 times more unpaid care work than men. In India, the gap is even more striking. According to the Time Use Survey of India, women spend around 299 minutes per day on unpaid domestic services, while men spend just 97 minutes. Think about what this means. Women are effectively running an entire parallel economy, one that keeps families functioning and enables the formal economy to operate. Yet, because this labor is unpaid, it remains invisible in national budgets. Gender budgeting attempts to correct this blindness. For example, if governments invest in childcare centers, water supply, or clean cooking fuel, they reduce the time women spend on unpaid labor, and that frees women to pursue education, employment, and political participation. Suddenly, something as technical as a budget allocation becomes deeply personal. It determines how many hours a woman spends carrying water. It determines whether she can take a job. It determines whether she has financial independence. India is actually one of the early adopters of gender budgeting. In 2005-06, the Government of India introduced a gender budget statement as part of the Union Budget. This statement categorizes government spending into 2 parts. Programs where 100% of funds benefit women, And secondly, programs where at least 30% of funds benefit women. Over time, multiple ministries from health to rural development began integrating gender perspectives into their spending. Examples include Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, a campaign aimed at addressing declining child sex ratios and promoting girls' education. Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, by providing LPG connections to women in poor households, the scheme aimed to reduce the health burden of cooking with firewood and reduce time spent collecting fuel. National Rural Livelihoods Mission. This program supports women's self-help groups and micro-enterprises, enabling rural women to participate in economic activities. These programs demonstrate how budgeting decisions can directly influence women's lives. But the reality is more complicated because gender budgeting often exists on paper more than in practice. So, what are the challenges of gender budgeting? Despite its promise, gender budgeting faces several obstacles. Tokenism. Sometimes ministries simply label existing programs as gender friendly without actually redesigning them. For example, if a rural employment program hires both men and women, it may be classified as gender responsive, even if workplace conditions are not safe or childcare is unavailable. Data gaps. Effective gender budgeting requires sex desegregated data. Governments need to know who benefits from spending, but in many sectors, this data simply does not exist. Then limited institutional capacity. Budget officials are often trained in economics and finance, not gender analysis. Without proper training, gender budgeting becomes a bureaucratic formality. Patriarchal policy assumptions. Many policies assume a male breadwinner model, but in reality, millions of households depend on women's labor and income. Without acknowledging these realities, budgets fail to address structural inequality. Now, why gender budgeting matters for everyone? Some critics argue that gender budgeting is unnecessary. They say budgets should be neutral, but neutrality in an unequal society often reinforces inequality. Consider public safety. If street lighting, transport systems, and policing fail to address women's safety concerns, women's mobility becomes restricted. That means fewer women in the workplace, and that affects the entire economy. In fact, global studies show that increasing women's labor force participation can dramatically boost GDP. So, gender budgeting is not merely a feminist demand, it is an economic strategy. When women have access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, societies become more prosperous. Let's bring this closer to home. Imagine two government policies. Policy A builds highways connecting major cities. Policy B invests in safe public buses connecting rural areas to nearby towns. Which policy benefits women more? For many women, especially in rural India, the second policy might be life-changing. It determines whether they can attend college, whether they can take a job, whether they can travel safely. And similarly, building toilets in schools dramatically increases girls' attendance during adolescence. Providing hostels for female students expands educational opportunities. Funding maternal health care reduces preventable deaths. Each of these decisions appears technical, but they shape women's lives in profound ways. Now, countries around the world have experimented with gender budgeting. Australia pioneered the concept in the 1980s. Sweden integrates gender equality into its fiscal policy. Rwanda, which has one of the highest percentages of women in parliament globally, has implemented strong gender-responsive budgeting frameworks. These experiences show that gender budgeting works best when three conditions are present: political commitment, institutional accountability, active civil society participation. Without these, gender budgeting risks becoming a symbolic gesture rather than a transformative tool. At this point, we might be wondering, what does budgeting have to do with our everyday lives? Honestly, everything. Budgets determine whether girls stay in school, mothers receive health care, women can travel safely, survivors of violence have support systems. Every rupee spent or not spent tells us whose lives matter. Gender budgeting simply asks governments to acknowledge that economic policy is never gender neutral and that justice requires intentional design. Budgets are often presented as numbers, columns, charts, fiscal deficits. But behind those numbers are human lives. A woman who spends 4 hours collecting firewood, a girl who drops out of school because there is no toilet, a mother who cannot reach a hospital in time. Gender budgeting forces us to ask a difficult but necessary question. If governments truly represent their citizens, why do so many budgets ignore the realities of half the population? Perhaps the goal of gender budgeting is not simply better accounting. Perhaps it is something deeper, a recognition that equality cannot exist without resources and that justice must be funded. Because at the end of the day, equality is not just an idea, it is a line item in a budget. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about budgets. They look so impersonal tables, percentages, fiscal targets, allocation charts. But hidden inside those numbers are entire lives. A girl who finally stays in school because she received a bicycle. A woman who breathes cleaner air because her kitchen no longer fills with smoke. A mother who can travel to work because public transport became affordable. A widow who earns her first independent income through a self help group. And on the other side of the ledger are the absences. The woman who drops out of college because there is no safe transport. The mother who dies because healthcare never reached her village. The girl whose dreams shrink because policy never considered her reality important enough to fund. That is what gender budgeting reveals. That inequality is not always loud. Sometimes it is hidden in what governments choose to prioritize, in what they choose to count, and more importantly, in what they choose to ignore. Because every budget is ultimately a moral document. It tells us whose labor is visible, whose safety matters, whose mobility matters, whose future deserves investment. And maybe the biggest myth we have been taught is that economics is objective and emotionless. It is not. Economics shapes intimacy, it shapes freedom, it shapes dignity, it decides who gets time, opportunity, safety, healthcare, education, rest, independence, and who must continue sacrificing silently to keep society functioning. Gender budgeting is not about asking for special treatment. It is about demanding that public policy finally acknowledge the reality of how people actually live. Because equality without resources is merely a slogan, and justice without funding is merely performance. Thank you so much for listening to me. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments or write to me personally at the email provided in the description. If this episode stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes budgets are just numbers, because they are not. Budgets shape bodies, they shape choices, they shape futures, and sometimes the distance between dependence and freedom is simply whether society decided a woman was worth investing in. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this conversation. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep looking beyond the obvious, because the personal has always been political. So do keep looking through the personal lens.